The wagon came up the north road just before dusk, and the boy driving it was too small for the reins in his hands. Silas Bramwell saw him from the porch and set down his coffee without finishing it. He had learned, in the 4 years since Martha died, to notice small wrong things the way other men noticed weather. A child that size should not have been driving a mule that tired, and the woman slumped on the bench beside him should not have been so still. He walked out to meet them before they reached the gate. The mule stopped of its own accord, grateful. The boy did not speak. He only looked at Silas the way a dog looks at a man holding a stick, deciding whether to run. "Easy now," Silas said. He kept his hands where the boy could see them. "You lost." "No, sir." The boy's voice was hoarse. "Mama said find the Bramwell Ranch. She said the man there wouldn't turn us off." Silas looked at the woman. She had a fever bright as a lantern in her cheeks, and her lips were cracked, and she was holding a bundle against her chest that Silas realized, with a slow cold turn in his stomach, was a baby. The baby was breathing. The mother was barely. How long she been like this? 2 days. Maybe 3. The boy's chin trembled once and then locked. Pa died in the spring. We've been walking since the bank took the house. Silas lifted the woman down himself. She weighed less than a saddle. The baby did not cry when he took it from her arms, and that worried him more than crying would have. He carried the mother into the house, set her on the bed that had been Martha's, and told the boy to bring water from the pump. The boy went without a word. He had the obedience of a child who had learned that arguing cost you the last thing you had. "Before we go any further tonight, settle in wherever you are. Pour yourself something warm, put your feet up, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. It always warms us to know who's with us at the fire." Now back to Silas, and the wagon, and the 3 lives that had just come to rest at his door. The woman died before sunrise. Silas had known she would. He had seen enough dying to read it in a face. He sat with her until it was finished because no woman should die in a stranger's house without a hand to hold. And then he closed her eyes and went out onto the porch where the boy was sitting with the baby wrapped in Silas's own coat. "She's gone," Silas said. He did not soften it. Children knew when you softened things, and softening made them trust you less. The boy nodded once. He did not cry. He said, "Her name was Ruth. Mine's Caleb. The baby's Hannah. Mama said tell you our names so you'd know we were real." "You're real," Silas said. "I know it." He buried Ruth on the ridge above the creek where the wild plum trees grew. Martha was up there too. He figured the 2 women would not mind the company. Caleb stood beside the grave holding Hannah, and when Silas was done and the last shovel of earth was patted flat, the boy looked up at him and asked the question Silas had been dreading. "Are you going to keep us?" Silas looked at the ridge and the wild plums and the small new mound of dirt beside the older one. He thought about the 4 years of silence in the house behind him. He thought about how a man could get used to silence the way a man could get used to any slow poison. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to keep you." Caleb did not smile. He only sat down in the grass beside his mother's grave and cried without sound, the way a boy cries when he has learned that noise draws bad things. Silas held the baby and waited, and when Caleb was done, they walked back down to the ranch together. That was the beginning of it. Word travels in a country where nothing else does, and by the end of that summer, 3 more children had come. A girl of 9 named Prudence, sent up the road by a woman in Cheyenne who said the girl's aunt had died of the coughing sickness and no one else would take her. A pair of brothers, 11 and 7, whose father had been hanged in Laramie for a crime Silas suspected he had not committed, though it did not matter now, because dead was dead and the boys were alive and hungry. Their names were Elias and Tom. The town of Redwater sat 6 miles south of the Bramwell Ranch, and the town of Redwater did not approve. Silas rode in for supplies on a Saturday in September and felt the looks before he heard the words. Mrs. Delacroix, who ran the boarding house, crossed the street rather than pass him on the boardwalk. The 2 Peterson brothers, who had once helped Silas move a barn, watched him with the flat faces of men who had chosen a side. At the mercantile, Hollis Vance the storekeeper wiped the same spot on his counter 3 times before he would meet Silas's eyes. "Heard you took in them Ballard boys," Hollis said. He wiped the spot again. "Whole town's talking. Let them talk. Their pa was a horse thief, Silas. Blood tells." Silas set his list on the counter. "Blood doesn't tell anything. People tell. And people are usually wrong." Hollis did not answer. He filled the order in silence. When Silas rode home with the wagon loaded, He passed the Delacroix boarding house, and he saw the curtain twitch, and he understood then that the trouble had not yet started. It was gathering. It was the kind of trouble that gathered slowly, like clouds a rancher watches from the porch without going in, because he wants to see exactly which direction the storm will break. The man behind the gathering was named Ambrose Kettering. He owned the bank in Redwater, and he owned the Redwater Gazette, and he owned the sheriff, and he had wanted the Bramwell Ranch for 11 years. He had offered Silas a fair price. Once, when Martha was still alive. He had offered Silas a lower price after Martha died. He had offered Silas nothing at all the third time, expecting grief to have worn the man down to the point of signing. Grief had not. Silas had refused him with a politeness that Kettering had never forgiven, because politeness from a man who cannot be bought is the deepest insult a man like Kettering knows. Kettering saw the orphans as a gift. A childless widower running a working ranch was a man the town felt sorry for. A widower filling his house with the discarded children of drunks and thieves and dead women was a man the town could be turned against. Kettering understood people the way a hunter understands wind. By November, there were 6 children at the ranch. Silas had built out the west room into a bunk room, and he had hired a woman named Ada Finch to come 3 days a week to help with the cooking and the mending. Ada was 34 and widowed, and she had lost a child of her own to the fever the year before, and she had stopped attending church because the pity in the pews had become unbearable. She came to the Bramwell Ranch the first day expecting to work in silence. She left that evening having laughed twice, which surprised her more than anything had surprised her in a year. She said very little about herself in those first weeks. Silas did not press. He had learned from Martha that some women needed the door left open and the room left empty, and eventually they walked in on their own. Ada walked in slowly. She began staying for supper. She began braiding Prudence's hair on the porch while the sun went down. She began, without meaning to, calling the ranch "we" when she talked about it in town, which was noted by the women at the well and reported to Mrs. Delacroix, and eventually reached the ears of Ambrose Kettering, who filed it away. The 7th child arrived in December, and she was the one who changed everything. Her name was Lyra, and she was 8 years old, and she was half Arapaho. Her mother had died in a fire that the sheriff of Redwater had recorded as an accident and that everyone in the county knew had not been. Her father had left before she was born. The woman who brought Lyra to the Bramwell Ranch was a sister of charity from the mission at Fort Washakie, and she rode in on a mule with the child wrapped in a blanket behind her, and she looked at Silas with the eyes of a woman who had been turned away from 6 other doors that week. "They said in town you were the one who'd take her," the sister said. She did not dismount. She was ready to ride on if he said no. Silas looked at the child. Lyra looked back at him with the flat, exhausted patience of a child who had been handed off and refused enough times that she no longer expected anything. "Bring her down," Silas said. The sister exhaled a breath that seemed to have been held for 100 miles. She lifted Lyra down. Lyra did not speak. She walked past Silas into the house as if she had been walking into strangers' houses her whole life, which she had, and she sat down on the bench by the fire and put her hands flat on her knees and waited to be told where to go next. Ada came out of the kitchen with flour on her apron and stopped in the doorway. She looked at Lyra. Lyra looked at her. Something moved in Ada's face that Silas had not seen before, a softening that was older than her own grief, older than the child she had lost, old as the first woman who ever looked at a child and knew her own heart. Ada crossed the room and knelt down in front of Lyra and said, "You must be tired. Would you like some bread and honey before we find you a bed?" Lyra nodded once. Ada took her hand, and Silas, watching from the doorway with his hat still in his hand, understood that his house had become something he did not yet have a word for. Word of the Arapaho child in the Bramwell house reached Ambrose Kettering on a Tuesday, and by Friday the Redwater Gazette carried an editorial about the disorderly refuge being kept north of town, and about the unnatural collection of children being raised without proper Christian oversight, and about the grave concern of the town's leading citizens regarding the moral welfare of these unfortunate souls. It did not mention Silas Bramwell by name. It did not need to. The following Sunday, Reverend Coles preached on the sanctity of order and the danger of well-meaning men who took upon themselves the burdens that properly belong to institutions. Ada, sitting in the back pew for the first time in a year, stood up in the middle of the sermon and walked out. 3 women watched her go. One of them, Mrs. Halloran, whose own son had been buried the previous spring, followed her outside and caught her arm on the church steps. "You're not alone in this," Mrs. Halloran said. It was all she said, but Ada carried those words home with her, and she did not forget them. If you were Ada in that moment, walking out of a church that had once been your only comfort, carrying a grief the town had grown tired of, riding out to a ranch full of children who were not yours and a man who had not asked for any of it, would you have stayed, or would you have kept riding? Sit with that a moment. Sometimes the hardest choice a woman makes is the one nobody sees her make. The trouble came for real in January. Kettering sent his lawyer up to the ranch on a cold, bright morning with a stack of papers and a proposition. Silas met him on the porch. He did not invite the man inside. The lawyer, whose name was Pruitt, was a thin man with a neck like a plucked chicken, and he read from his papers with the practiced disinterest of a man who had ruined many lives without ever raising his voice. The county, Pruitt said, had reviewed the matter of the children in Silas Bramwell's care. The county was concerned. The county had determined that a single man of Silas's age, without formal certification and without proper facilities, was not a suitable guardian for 7 minor children of varied and questionable background. The county was prepared to remove the children and place them in appropriate institutions. Unless what? Silas said. Pruitt smiled the small, dry smile of his employer. Mr. Kettering is prepared to purchase this property at a generous price. Should you accept, Mr. Kettering will personally see to it that the children are placed in good Christian homes throughout the county. Your cooperation will be remembered. Silas said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard. Somewhere behind the barn, Caleb was teaching Tom how to throw a rope, and their voices came thin and bright across the cold air. "Tell Kettering," Silas said, "that I've buried a wife on this land, and I've buried a woman who trusted me with her children on this land, and I will bury him on this land before he takes one child from this house. You can put that in your papers if you like. I've got no objection to it being in writing." Pruitt's smile did not change. "That's a threat, Mr. Bramwell. It's a promise. Threats are for men who don't mean them." Pruitt left. Silas watched him ride down the road until he was gone from sight, and then he stood on the porch a long time, looking at nothing, letting the cold work its way into him until he could think clearly. Ada came out with a shawl around her shoulders and stood beside him without speaking. After a while she put her hand on the porch rail, close to his but not touching, and he moved his own hand the small distance necessary, and they stood like that until the sun was down. That night, after the children were asleep, Silas rode to the Halloran place. Mr. Halloran was a rancher of his own, quiet and thick-shouldered, and he had lost a boy the same year Silas had lost Martha. Silas sat at the Halloran kitchen table and told the man what Kettering intended, and Halloran listened without interruption, and when Silas was done, Halloran said only, "How many riders you figure he'll bring?" 6. Maybe 8. He won't come himself. He won't. Men like that never do. Halloran refilled Silas's coffee. "I'll bring 4 with me. Good men. Men who owe Kettering nothing and hate him plenty. When? I don't know. Soon. I'll be ready when it is." Silas rode home under a hard sky full of stars, and he thought about Martha, and he thought about Ruth dying in Martha's bed, and he thought about Lyra's small hand in Ada's, and he understood that a man could spend 4 years being dead inside his own body and then wake up in a single week because 7 children and 1 woman and 1 bright winter morning had refused to let him stay buried. They came on a Thursday. Kettering sent 9 riders with the sheriff at their head, which was a mistake on Kettering's part, because the sheriff was a coward and cowards break first. The riders came up the north road at mid-morning, and by the time they reached the gate, they found the gate closed and Silas Bramwell standing behind it with a rifle across his arms, and behind Silas, arranged along the fence line, stood Halloran and 4 other men from the county, each of them armed and none of them smiling. The sheriff reined in. He looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at the men at the fence. He looked at Silas. "Silas," the sheriff said. His voice cracked, and he cleared it. "I've got a court order." "Signed by who?" "Judge Willem." "Judge Willem is Kettering's cousin. That order isn't worth the paper it's written on, and you know it, Marcus. It's still a court order." "Then read it out loud. Read it so all these men hear what it says. Read it so the newspaper up in Laramie can print exactly what you tried to do today." The sheriff did not read it. He sat on his horse, and the paper trembled in his hand, and behind him, One of Kettering's riders, a man named Bell who had shot a Mexican farmhand in the back 2 years earlier and never answered for it, spurred his horse forward and drew his pistol. Silas shot the pistol out of Bell's hand before Bell had time to raise it. It was a good shot at that distance, and it was not a lucky one. Silas had been a soldier once, long before Martha, and the war had taught him things a man does not forget. Bell howled and grabbed his wrist. His horse spun and threw him. He landed hard in the road. "The next one," Silas said, "is not going to be a warning." The riders sat very still. Halloran's men had not moved, and their rifles were up, and the arithmetic of the situation had changed in the space of a single second. The sheriff looked at Kettering's men and saw that they were not going to die for Kettering's ranch expansion. He looked at Silas and saw a man who would die for what stood behind him. He folded the paper. "We're leaving," the sheriff said. "You're leaving," Silas agreed. "And when you get back to town, you're going to the newspaper in Laramie, not the one Kettering owns, and you're going to tell them what happened here today, and you're going to tell them why. Because if you don't, Marcus, I will. And I'll tell them about the Sawyer fire too, and the Mexican boy, and the 3 deeds Kettering forged in '82. You understand me?" The sheriff's face went the color of old paper. He understood. He had understood for years. He had only been waiting for someone to make him say it out loud. They rode away. Bell was carried on the back of another man's horse, cradling his ruined hand. The dust of them hung in the road for a long time after they were gone. If this story is stirring something in you tonight, if it's putting you back in mind of someone you loved, or someone who stood up when standing up cost them, a small like and a subscribe tells us to keep telling these stories. This one was written for you. That night Ada came into the front room after the children were asleep. Silas was cleaning the rifle at the table by the lamp. He did not look up when she came in, but he moved the cloth aside and made space beside him. She sat down. She did not speak for a while. Then she said, "I was going to tell you I couldn't come back after tomorrow. I had it planned. I was going to tell you it was too much for me. My husband, and then my baby, and then this house full of other people's children, and every time I laughed here it felt like a betrayal of the ones I lost. I had it all worked out how I was going to say it." Silas set down the cloth. He waited. "But then Pruitt came," Ada said, "and you stood on that porch. And I understood that I hadn't been staying here because I was strong enough to. I'd been staying because it was the only place in the world where my grief had somewhere to go besides down." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you." Silas did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. He reached across the table, slowly, and he took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in the lamplight for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the pasture, a mare called to her foal, and the foal answered, and the sound of it went out into the cold and the dark like a small clean bell. Kettering did not come again. The story of what happened at the Bramwell gate reached Laramie within the week, and the Laramie paper printed it in full, and then it was picked up in Cheyenne, and then in Denver, and by March there was a federal marshal riding up the road to Redwater with questions about the Sawyer fire and the forged deeds, and a Mexican farmhand named Emiliano Cruz whose family had never stopped asking what happened. Kettering ran. He made it as far as the rail yard in Cheyenne before the marshal caught him. His bank was seized. The Gazette was sold at auction. His house in Redwater went to pay the Cruz family and the Sawyer widow and 3 other families whose land he had taken through paperwork nobody had ever dared to challenge. He died 6 years later in the territorial prison in Laramie, of a lung sickness he had brought on himself with rage, and the town of Redwater, which had feared him and flattered him for 20 years, did not send a single mourner to his grave. The ranch grew. Silas built a second bunkhouse in the spring and a schoolroom in the fall, and Ada, who had been coming 3 days a week, began coming every day, and then one evening in April she did not go home at all, and neither of them made any speech about it, because some things do not require speeches. Reverend Coles married them in the yard under the cottonwoods the following June, and every one of the 7 children stood up with them, and Prudence carried the ring, and Lyra held Ada's hand the whole way through the vows, and did not let go until Ada had said yes. 10 more children came over the next 12 years. Some stayed a season. Some stayed a lifetime. Caleb grew tall and quiet, and took over the north pasture when Silas's knees began to give. Hannah grew into a laughing girl with her mother's eyes, and she never remembered Ruth. But she knew her name, and she knew where the wild plums grew on the ridge, and every spring she brought flowers up to the two graves and sat between them and told her mothers about the year. Elias became a doctor. Tom became a rancher of his own, 2 counties over. Prudence married a schoolteacher and named her first daughter Ada. Lyra went east to a school for teachers and came back and taught the ranch school for 30 years, and the children who passed through her classroom carried something out of it that they could never quite name, but that they recognized whenever they saw it again in the world. Silas lived to be 81. He died on a warm September afternoon on the porch he had walked out onto that first evening to meet a wagon he had not asked for. Ada was beside him. She held his hand until it was cold. She lived 9 more years and was buried between him and Martha and Ruth, on the ridge above the creek where the wild plums grew, and Lyra spoke at her grave, and Caleb wept openly, and Hannah, who was by then a grown woman with children of her own, laid the flowers. The ranch is still there. It is called the Bramwell home now, and it takes in children the state has given up on, and it has never once turned one away. Above the doorway of the main house, carved into the old cottonwood beam that Silas set in place himself in the summer of 1884, there is a line that Ada asked him to carve after their first Christmas together, when the house had been so full of children that they had to eat in shifts, and the noise of it had made her cry with a kind of joy she had not believed was still available to her. The line reads, "A house is only a house until someone the world threw away walks in and calls it home." That is the last thing visitors see when they come out onto the porch in the evening, and the last thing the children see when they turn back for one last look before riding off into whatever lives are waiting for them. A carved beam. A porch worn smooth by 100 years of small feet. The wild plum trees on the ridge, still blooming every spring, white as a promise kept. Next time, we'll tell you the story of a widow who inherited nothing but a broken piano and a letter she was told never to open, and the drifter who rode into her yard the same afternoon claiming he had come to tune it. Until then, take care of your own, hold the ones you have close, and we'll see you at the fire.